Before the first pale light of morning appeared above the eastern water, the lighthouse at Greyhaven had already begun its quiet work. The great lamp turned slowly within its glass chamber, sending its beam across the dark sea at measured intervals, so that for a few moments the waves below were touched with a cold silver brightness before the darkness gathered them back again. Beyond the cliffs, where the sea stretched toward a horizon that could not yet be distinguished from the sky, there was only the faintest suggestion of dawn, a thin grey softness beneath the clouds, while nearer at hand, the wet grass and low stone walls of the headland remained almost invisible in the mist. The lighthouse itself stood upon the highest part of the cliff, an old round tower built of weather-darkened stone, its walls pale in places where years of wind and salt had worn them smooth, and darker where the rain had gathered in the narrow seams between the blocks. At its foot stood the keeper's cottage, small and square beneath its slate roof, with 2 chimneys and a garden, enclosed by a low wall which had never entirely succeeded in keeping out the sea wind. Within the cottage, Elias Bell was awake. He had been awake for some minutes before he moved, lying quietly beneath the heavy wool blanket and listening to the familiar sounds that belonged to the hour before sunrise. There was the soft movement of the wind around the corners of the house, the occasional tapping of a loose branch against the kitchen window, and beneath everything else, so constant that a stranger might not have noticed it at all, the deep and patient breathing of the sea. Elias had lived beside that sound for so many years that he no longer thought of it as noise. It was simply there. On mornings when the weather was calm, the sea spoke in a low and even voice, and on winter nights when the wind came hard from the west, it could be heard as far inland as the village, striking the foot of the cliffs with such force that the windows seemed to tremble in sympathy. Elias had learned, over the course of a long life, that the sea possessed as many tempers as people did, and rather more honesty in displaying them. He turned his head toward the small clock on the mantel. The hands were approaching 5. There was no reason to remain in bed. Elias pushed back the blanket and sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, waiting for the stiffness in his knees to ease. He did not consider this delay worth remarking upon. He had been getting out of bed slowly for several years now, just as he had been climbing stairs more carefully, reading small print nearer to the window, and finding that a cup of tea tasted better when it was allowed to cool for a minute or 2. There were many things a man learned to accept when he had lived long enough. He reached for his waistcoat, buttoned it carefully, and then paused beside the little chest of drawers near the window. On top of it stood a photograph in a narrow wooden frame. The photograph was old enough that the edges had softened beneath the glass, and the face of the woman in it had become slightly pale with the passing years, yet Elias knew every line of that face. Margaret. He did not pick up the photograph. He merely looked at it while fastening the last button of his coat, and then turned away. Outside, the first gull cried above the cliffs. Elias took his lantern and went out into the passage. The lighthouse staircase began where the cottage ended, rising within the tower in a long spiral of worn stone steps. He had climbed those stairs so often that he could have done so in darkness, though he preferred to carry the lantern in the early morning, not because he needed its light, but because the small golden circle it cast seemed to make the tower less empty. At the 3rd step from the bottom he stopped. His hand rested upon the iron rail. For a moment he listened. The wind had changed during the night. It was not much of a change, and a younger man might have noticed nothing at all, but Elias had spent too many years studying the weather to ignore such things. The air felt damp against his cheek, and somewhere beyond the western side of the tower, the sea was making a deeper sound than it had made yesterday. He continued upward. By the time he reached the lamp room, the eastern sky had begun to lighten. The great lens stood before him, quiet and magnificent in the dimness, its glass catching the first grey light from the windows. Elias set down the lantern and began his morning inspection. He moved slowly, but not uncertainly. There was a particular order to his work, and he had never seen any reason to change it merely because the years had changed him. First the glass, then the mechanism, then the oil, then the turning apparatus, and finally the lamp itself. Every part had its place, every movement its proper moment. He wiped a thin film of salt from the glass. The cloth made a soft, whispering sound against the polished surface. Below him, the sea continued to move. The first light of morning reached the horizon, and for a moment, the whole world seemed suspended between night and day. The water was neither black nor blue, but a deep grey-green, broken here and there by long bands of pale silver. The village of Greyhaven remained hidden beneath the mist, while the roofs of 2 distant cottages appeared above it like small dark islands. Elias looked toward them. He knew which cottage belonged to the baker. He knew which chimney belonged to the house where the Henderson children had grown up. He knew the church tower, though he could not yet see it clearly, and beyond the church, he knew the narrow lane which led toward the harbour. A man might live in a city for 50 years and never know 100 yards of it, as well as Elias knew that small stretch of coast. He turned back to his work. There was comfort in repetition. The world changed constantly, but the lamp must still be cleaned, the mechanism checked, the windows kept clear, and the light made ready for the coming night. When he had finished, Elias stood beside the window for a while. The sun had not yet risen, but the darkness was withdrawing. He thought, not for the first time, that dawn was much quieter than people imagined. It did not arrive like a door being opened. It came gradually, almost apologetically, taking one color away and giving another in its place. He smiled faintly at the thought. If dawn had been left to people, he suspected, it would make far too much noise about the matter. He descended the staircase and returned to the cottage. By 6 o'clock, the kettle had begun to sing. Elias made his tea and stood by the kitchen window while the garden slowly emerged from the mist. Margaret had once kept flowers there, though the garden had never been especially kind to flowers. The wind stripped the roses, the salt found its way through the soil, and anything delicate tended to surrender before the end of summer. Still, Margaret had always planted something. There were lavender plants near the wall, thyme between the stones, and an old rosemary bush which had survived so many winters that Elias had long ago stopped wondering whether it was alive or merely too stubborn to die. He touched one of its branches as he passed. The scent rose faintly in the cold air. For an instant, he remembered Margaret standing in almost the same place, her sleeves rolled back, a basket at her feet, complaining that the gulls had eaten the young plants again. He could almost hear her saying it. Then the memory faded. Elias took his breakfast. There was bread, butter, a boiled egg and tea, and he ate without hurry, as a man does when he has nowhere to be except where he already is. At 7:15, he heard footsteps on the path outside. They were unmistakably Thomas Reed's footsteps, partly because the young man walked as though he had been sent into the world with the instruction to make certain every stone knew of his existence. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. Elias opened it. Thomas stood there with a cloth bag under one arm and his cap slightly crooked. "Morning, Mr. Bell. You are late." Thomas looked at the sky. "I thought the sun was late too. The sun has been keeping time longer than you have." Thomas considered this. "I suppose that is true. It generally is." Elias stepped aside to let him enter. Thomas placed the bag upon the table and began removing its contents: a loaf of bread, a small packet of tea, some butter wrapped in paper, and a parcel of lamp oil. The bread had been placed beneath the butter, and the butter had consequently lost something of its dignity. Elias regarded it. Thomas noticed. "It is still butter. I am relieved. It may have suffered a little. Most things do, eventually." Thomas smiled. He was a good lad, Elias thought, though he possessed the unfortunate confidence of youth, which was to believe that every mistake was temporary and every difficulty could be solved by doing the same thing again with greater enthusiasm. Elias had once possessed that confidence himself. He was not certain he had ever been entirely cured of it. Thomas took off his coat and followed him toward the tower. They climbed together. At the first landing, Thomas looked toward the small window. "Will it rain?" Elias did not answer immediately. He looked through the glass at the sea. Thomas waited. "The water is darker than yesterday." Thomas looked at the water. "It looks the same to me." "It will not always." "Does that mean rain?" "It means you should watch." Thomas nodded solemnly, as though he had just been entrusted with a matter of great importance. Elias continued upward. After a moment, Thomas followed. The young man was beginning to learn that Elias did not always answer a question directly. Sometimes he answered by showing Thomas where to look. At the top, Elias began the inspection. Thomas watched. He had been with Elias for nearly a year, yet there were still moments when he seemed surprised by the amount of care that went into keeping a single light burning. "It is only a lamp," he said once. Elias had looked at him for several seconds. "It is never only a lamp." Thomas had not understood then. He was beginning to. A lighthouse was built of stone and glass, brass and iron, oil and machinery, but its purpose reached far beyond any of those things. Somewhere out upon the dark water there might be a ship whose captain had never seen Greyhaven, whose sailors knew nothing of the village below the cliffs, and who might never know the name of the man who cleaned the glass each morning. Yet they would see the light. That was enough. When the work was finished, Thomas asked Elias how long he had been keeping the lighthouse. "Long enough. That is not a number." "No." Thomas smiled. "Were you young when you began?" Elias looked at the lens. "Yes." "What was it like?" Elias thought about this. The stairs seemed longer. Thomas laughed. "And now?" "Now I know they are." They descended a little later. The day had fully arrived by then, though the sun remained behind a pale veil of cloud. Greyhaven appeared gradually beneath them as the mist loosened its hold upon the village. Chimneys rose first, then roofs, then the narrow lanes, and finally the church tower, standing among the houses like a quiet old gentleman who had been there long enough to be trusted with everybody's secrets. Elias took his coat. "We are going down." Thomas picked up the empty oil tin. "To the village?" "To Agnes." Thomas nodded. "Will she have tea?" "She always has tea." "How do you know?" "Because Agnes has been making tea since before you were born." "That does not mean she will make it today." Elias put on his hat. "It does." Thomas followed him out. The road down to Greyhaven curved along the cliff, sometimes hidden between low hedges, sometimes opening suddenly toward the sea. The autumn grass was wet beneath their boots, and here and there small drops of water clung to the spider webs stretched between the bushes. The wind had fallen since dawn, leaving the air unusually still, and in that stillness they could hear the faint clatter of carts from the village below. Far out on the water, a fishing boat moved slowly through the pale morning light. Elias stopped to watch it. Thomas stopped too. Neither spoke. The boat was small against the sea. After a while, Elias continued down the path. Greyhaven was beginning its day. A baker opened his shutters. A woman shook a rug from an upstairs window. Two boys hurried toward the harbour, carrying something between them, which Elias suspected had been borrowed without permission. A dog slept beneath the bench outside the post office, apparently unconcerned with the duties of the nation. There was nothing remarkable about any of it. That was precisely why Elias liked it. He had known villages that had become proud of themselves, towns that had grown too quickly, and cities where people walked past one another without ever learning who lived behind the next door. Greyhaven remained content to be ordinary. Agnes Whitcomb's tea shop stood near the centre of the village, between the baker and the little haberdashery. The windows were fogged from within, and when Elias opened the door, the familiar warmth of tea, bread and coal smoke greeted him. Agnes looked up. "You are late." Elias removed his hat. "Apparently, everyone has agreed upon this opinion today." She placed a cup on the table. "You were expected 20 minutes ago. I was detained by the sea." The sea has always been an unreliable excuse. Thomas sat down. Elias looked at him. "Do not encourage her. I have said nothing. That is how it begins." Agnes smiled and poured the tea. For a while, they spoke of ordinary things: the price of coal, the weather, a roof that needed repairing near the harbour, and Mrs. Pritchard's youngest boy, who had apparently decided that school was an institution invented specifically to prevent him from enjoying himself. Elias listened. The warmth of the room seemed pleasant after the damp morning, and for a little while the lighthouse felt very far away. Then Agnes said, almost casually, "There was a gentleman from the district office in town yesterday." Elias lifted his cup. "Was there?" "Yes." "What did he want?" Agnes shrugged. "Nothing that concerned me." Elias took a sip of tea. Thomas looked from one to the other. Agnes continued. "He asked about the lighthouse." Elias lowered his cup. Only then did Thomas notice the slight change in his face. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was simply a moment in which something old and certain had been disturbed. Did he say why? No. Agnes folded her hands. "I expect you will know soon enough." Elias nodded. "Yes." He finished his tea. Outside, the church clock struck 10. The sound travelled through the village and across the wet fields, reaching even the cliffs beyond. Elias listened to the final stroke. Then he stood. There was still work to be done at the lighthouse. There was always work to be done. And so he and Thomas left the warmth of Agnes's tea shop and began the long walk home beneath a sky that was slowly clearing above the sea. Neither of them spoke much on the way back. The wind had begun to rise again, carrying with it the clean, cold smell of salt water. By the time they reached the cottage, the first blue opening had appeared between the clouds. Elias stood by the gate for a moment and looked up at the lighthouse. The tower seemed taller from below. It always had. He had spent so many years climbing toward its light that he sometimes forgot how it appeared to those who stood at the foot of it. Thomas went inside. Elias remained outside. In his coat pocket was a letter he had received that morning. He had not opened it yet. His hand rested briefly against the paper. Then he entered the cottage. The kettle was filled. The fire was still warm. And above the cottage, in the great lantern room, the mechanism waited quietly for evening. By noon, the sky had cleared sufficiently for a little sunlight to fall across the kitchen table, though the light had none of the warmth of summer and seemed, rather, to have travelled a long distance merely to assure the inhabitants of Greyhaven that the day had not entirely forgotten them. A narrow beam entered through the window above the sink, touched the rim of the kettle, moved across the worn boards of the table, and came to rest upon Elias Bell's hand. The letter was still there. He had taken it from his coat pocket and placed it beside his plate, where it remained unopened while he finished his bread and cheese. It was not that he feared what it contained. Fear was a word Elias had seldom found useful, and during his years beside the sea, he had learned that most things which inspired fear became less troublesome once they were looked at directly. A storm was a storm. A broken mechanism was a broken mechanism, and a letter from the district office was, after all, only a letter. Yet there were some things a man could postpone without being a coward. He finished his tea. He washed the cup. He dried it and put it away. Only then did he return to the table. The envelope was thick, the paper of better quality than anything Elias ordinarily received, and the seal had been pressed carefully into the wax. He turned it over once before opening it. For a moment, he thought of Margaret. She had always disliked official letters. Not because she disliked officials, but because she maintained that any letter which began with the words, "I am instructed to inform you," could almost certainly have been written in half the number of sentences. Elias smiled. The smile disappeared slowly. He opened the letter. The first paragraph concerned the condition of the lighthouse. The second concerned the maintenance of the lamp. The third was longer. Elias read it twice. The district authority wished to review the appointment of the keeper at Greyhaven. The wording was careful, even considerate. His years of service were acknowledged. His reliability was mentioned. His knowledge of the coast was described as valuable. There was no accusation, no complaint, and no suggestion that he had failed in his duties. It was, in some respects, a very kind letter. That made it more difficult. Elias folded the paper once. Then again. He placed it upon the table. Outside, the wind moved through the rosemary bush. He looked toward the window. The garden was bright now, though the grass remained wet beneath the sunlight. A few fallen leaves had gathered against the low stone wall, and one of the old rose stems Margaret had planted years before had turned almost black with the cold. Elias rose. He went outside. He did not know precisely why. Perhaps because there were moments when a room became too small for a man's thoughts, and the open air was preferable, even when it was cold. He walked slowly along the garden wall. The lighthouse stood behind him, its whitewashed upper section shining faintly in the afternoon light. He had expected this letter someday. That was the strange part. A man could know that a thing must happen and still be surprised when it finally arrived. He had known, for several years, that he was growing older. He knew the stairs were harder than they had once been, that his hands were slower on particularly cold mornings, and that after a long day of work, he sometimes sat beside the fire without immediately remembering what he had intended to do next. None of this had seemed important, while it belonged to the future. Now the future had arrived in an envelope. Elias stopped beside the rosemary bush. He touched one of its branches. The scent was sharp and green. Margaret had planted it in the spring of their 3rd year at the lighthouse. He remembered the day because the wind had been so strong that the little spade kept catching in the soil. "You will never grow anything here," he had told her. She had looked at him with the patient expression she reserved for opinions she had no intention of respecting. "It will grow. It will be eaten by the salt. Then I shall plant another. It will be blown away. Then I shall plant another. You are wasting your time," she had smiled. "No, Elias, I am occupying it." He had never forgotten that. He stood with his hand resting on the rosemary, and for a little while the garden seemed to contain more of her than it had for many years. Not her voice exactly. Not her face. Something quieter. The shape of a life. A basket left beside the door. A shawl hanging from the back of a chair. A cup of tea cooling because she had become distracted while speaking. The little sounds of another person moving through a house. Elias withdrew his hand. There was a knock at the gate. He turned. Thomas stood outside with a bundle of rope over one shoulder. "I thought you might need this." Elias looked at the rope. "I do." Thomas opened the gate. Then he looked at Elias. "Are you well?" "Yes." Thomas hesitated. "You look as though you have been thinking." "I have." "About the letter?" Elias raised an eyebrow. Thomas immediately regretted the question. Agnes said, "Of course she did. She did not tell me what it said. She was not required to." "No." Thomas looked down at the rope. After a moment, Elias said, "The district office is reviewing the lighthouse." Thomas's face changed. "Why?" "They are getting new ideas." "About what?" "Everything." Thomas was silent. Elias almost smiled. The young were remarkably good at discovering that the future was frightening when it had not yet happened. "It does not mean anything has been decided," Elias said. Thomas nodded, though he clearly did not find this entirely reassuring. "Will you stay?" Elias looked toward the lighthouse. The afternoon sun was falling upon its upper windows, and for a moment the glass seemed almost golden. "I have stayed through worse weather than this." Thomas smiled faintly. "I suppose that is true. Besides," Elias added, "I have not yet finished teaching you how not to ruin bread with butter." Thomas looked offended. "That happened once. Once is sufficient to establish a tradition." They carried the rope toward the tower. The subject of the letter was not mentioned again. That was Elias's preference. He had never believed that every thought must be spoken merely because it existed. Some thoughts needed time. The afternoon passed quietly. There was a loose section of railing near the western path, and Elias and Thomas repaired it together. The work was simple, requiring little conversation. Thomas held the post while Elias measured it, and every now and then the older man corrected the younger man's grip or told him to move a fraction to the left. By 4 o'clock, the wind had strengthened. The sea was darker again. The first gulls had begun to disappear toward the harbor, and the long shadows of the cliff reached across the grass. Elias looked toward the horizon. "Rain tonight." Thomas followed his gaze. "How can you tell?" "Clouds. There are hardly any." "That is because you are looking at the clouds." Thomas frowned. "What should I look at?" "The sea." The young man stared at the water. For a while, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he began to understand. The surface was unusually smooth beneath the wind, and the color had changed. The distant water carried a dull green tone beneath the gray sky. "Rain," Thomas said. "Probably." Thomas looked pleased. Elias did not tell him that he had been wrong about the weather 3 days ago. There were some lessons best learned without assistance. By 5 o'clock, the first drops had begun to strike the windows. The rain came gently at first, tapping against the glass in scattered little sounds, then becoming steadier as evening approached. Elias lit the lamp. Thomas watched him. The flame caught. The mechanism began its slow movement. The great lens turned. Light crossed the darkening sea. Thomas stood beside the window. "I think I understand now." Elias looked at him. "What? Why you like it here?" Elias did not answer immediately. He looked out at the sea. Beyond the glass, the rain had softened the world. The cliffs disappeared into mist. The village lights began to appear one by one, tiny and warm beneath the darkening sky. "I do not know if liking it is the right word," he said. Thomas waited. Elias rested his hand upon the window frame. "It is simply the place where my life happened." The words were quiet. Thomas said nothing. And Elias was grateful for that. Later, after Thomas had gone down to the cottage, Elias remained in the lantern room. The rain continued. The lighthouse turned. Again and again, the light passed across the sea. Elias thought of the letter, then of Margaret, then of the first winter they had spent at Greyhaven. It had been 38 years ago. He remembered the cottage being colder than it was now. He remembered the roof leaking. He remembered Margaret placing a saucepan beneath the leak and telling him that at least the rain had the good manners to announce itself before entering. He remembered laughing. He had not expected to remember that. Memory was an odd companion. It did not arrive when called. It appeared when it pleased, sometimes bringing with it a whole afternoon, sometimes only the sound of a voice. Elias closed his eyes. For a moment, he could hear Margaret moving about the old kitchen. Then the sound of the present returned. Rain, wind, the slow mechanism, the sea. He opened his eyes. The room was empty, but it did not feel empty. Not entirely. That night, Elias went downstairs later than usual. He ate soup beside the fire and read the letter once more. The final paragraph stated that a representative from the district office would visit Greyhaven within the month. Elias folded the letter carefully. He placed it in the drawer beside Margaret's old sewing box. For a moment his hand remained upon the drawer. Then he closed it. He did not lock it. There was no need. When he went upstairs again, the rain had begun to lessen. The clouds were breaking over the sea. Through the glass of the lantern room, Elias could see a few stars. He stood quietly beneath them. The light turned. For one brief moment, the beam crossed the face of the water and illuminated a small fishing boat far offshore. Then the boat disappeared again into darkness. Elias watched until the next turn. There it was, and then it was gone. He thought of all the years in which he had watched that same light cross the sea. Thousands upon thousands of nights, storms, calm evenings, fog, snow, summer mornings when the sunrise came too early, winter afternoons when darkness seemed to arrive before the day's work was finished. The lighthouse had remained. So had the sea. Only the people had changed. Elias placed one hand upon the brass rail. He thought of Margaret. He thought of Clara. He thought of Thomas. And, for the first time, he wondered whether the lighthouse had begun to outlive the man who had cared for it. He did not find the thought frightening, only sad. And sadness, Elias had learned, was not always something that needed to be driven away. Sometimes it was enough to sit beside it for a while. So he remained there. The lamp turned. The rain faded. The sea breathed beneath the cliffs, and above Greyhaven, the old lighthouse continued to send its patient light across the darkness, as it had done the night before, and the night before that, and would do again tomorrow, whether Elias was there to watch it or not. For the moment, however, he was there, and that was enough. The rain had passed by morning, leaving Greyhaven washed and quiet beneath a sky in which the clouds moved slowly eastward, breaking now and then to admit a thin, pearly light upon the sea. The stones of the lighthouse were dark with moisture, and along the low wall surrounding the cottage, little drops of water trembled upon the rosemary and lavender before falling soundlessly into the earth. The air carried that particular freshness which followed rain beside the sea, when every smell seemed newly sharpened: the salt upon the wind, the wet grass, the damp stone, the faint smoke rising from chimneys in the village below. Elias Bell stood outside the cottage, with his coat buttoned to the throat, looking toward the harbour. There was no particular reason for him to be there. He had finished his breakfast. The lamp had been checked. Thomas had not yet arrived. There was nothing in the garden which required attention, and the weather was not sufficiently troublesome to demand a careful examination of the sea. Yet Elias remained. Perhaps he was waiting. He would not have admitted it, even to himself. But when the distant sound of wheels came up the road from the village, he knew, before he saw the carriage, that it was Clara. She had a way of arriving at Greyhaven which suggested that she considered the entire coast road a personal inconvenience arranged specifically to delay her. The small hired carriage appeared beyond the bend, moving slowly over the wet stones, its wheels sending little sprays of muddy water toward the hedges. The horse was a patient brown creature with one white foot, and the driver sat hunched beneath a dark coat, while behind him Clara Bell could just be seen through the glass. Elias straightened. The carriage stopped beside the cottage. Clara stepped down carefully, gathering her skirt in one hand and carrying a travelling bag in the other. Her bonnet was plain, trimmed with a narrow ribbon, and several strands of brown hair had escaped near her temple, despite the fact that she had evidently taken considerable trouble to keep them in place. She looked at the lighthouse, then at the sea, then at Elias. "You have not repaired the path. Good morning to you too. It is muddy. It has rained. I noticed. Elias took her bag. You have been away too long. Clara looked at him. 3 weeks. That is too long. You said last time that I ought to come less often. I may have been mistaken. She smiled. It was one of the things Elias liked about Clara. She did not make a great ceremony of affection. She simply stood nearer when she was pleased to see him, and in the years since Margaret's death, that had come to mean more to him than any number of sentimental speeches could have done. She looked again toward the lighthouse. Is Thomas here? Not yet. Then I have arrived before him. You often do. That is because I am punctual. It may also be because Thomas walks everywhere, as though he expects to be stopped and questioned by every person he meets. Clara laughed softly. The driver cleared his throat from the road. Elias gave him a few coins, thanked him, and watched the carriage turn away. When the sound of the wheels had faded, Clara carried her gloves into the cottage and placed them beside the stove. The house seemed to change when she entered. It was a small thing, and Elias might not have been able to explain it, but the quiet rooms appeared less empty. Clara opened the kitchen curtains. She lifted the lid of the kettle. She moved a chair a few inches away from the table, and then, having apparently decided that it had been badly placed, moved it back again. She had inherited that habit from Margaret. Elias watched her. Clara noticed. What? Nothing. You are looking at me. I am allowed. Not for too long. He smiled. She removed her bonnet. Uncle, you have become thinner. I have not. You have. The coat is older. That is precisely what you always say. Because it is true. Clara shook her head and went toward the pantry. You have very little food. I have enough. You have bread. Yes. And eggs. Yes. And 1 onion. It is a good onion. It is not a meal. It could become one. Clara turned to look at him. Have you been eating properly? Yes. Every day? Yes. Without forgetting. Elias considered this. Most days. Clara sighed. Then I shall stay for a few days. You need not. I know. She began unpacking. Elias did not argue. He knew that tone. It was the same tone Margaret had once used when she announced that she would plant rosemary beside the wall, despite his objections. There were certain decisions in the Bell family which were presented as conversations, but were, in truth, already settled. Clara had brought a basket of apples, a jar of preserves, some fresh bread, 2 small chickens wrapped in paper, and a parcel of tea. Elias looked at the provisions. You have brought half the town. Only the useful half. And the other half. Mostly people. He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, but Clara looked pleased. Later, while Clara arranged the kitchen and Elias repaired the loose hinge of a cupboard, the conversation turned naturally toward the district office. She had heard. Of course she had. News travelled quickly along the coast. Agnes wrote to me, Clara said. Elias tightened the screw. Agnes writes to everyone. She was concerned. Agnes is concerned when the weather changes direction. This is different. Elias looked at Clara. She was standing by the table with a folded cloth in her hands. Did you know, he asked, about the review? Yes. I had heard something. And you did not tell me. I did not want to worry you. He raised an eyebrow. You thought I would be worried by information. I thought you would dislike it. That is different. Yes. Clara folded the cloth again. For a while, there was only the sound of the kettle beginning to warm. Then she said, they may want someone younger. Elias looked down at the hinge. They may. You have been there 38 years. 39 in March. Clara was quiet. Then you should not have to leave. Elias placed the screwdriver upon the table. He did not answer immediately. Outside, A gull passed low over the garden wall, its wings catching the pale morning light. Finally he said, "Wanting something and keeping it are not always the same." Clara looked at him. The words were simple, but she heard something beneath them. "You have thought about leaving?" "No, you have. I have thought about the possibility. That is the same thing." "It is not. To you, perhaps." Elias smiled faintly. "You sound like your aunt." Clara lowered her eyes. Margaret had been her aunt, and although she had been gone many years, there were moments when Clara's expression became so like hers that Elias felt the old ache of recognition before he could prevent it. He did not speak of it. He merely picked up the screwdriver again. Clara saw his hand pause. She understood. There was no need to ask. That was one of the quiet mercies of family. Not everything needed to be explained. By late morning, the clouds had thinned enough for sunlight to reach the sea. Clara walked down to the garden with a basket on her arm, and Elias followed at a slower pace. The garden was small and somewhat untidy, though not from neglect. The sea wind had a talent for arranging things according to its own principles, and no gardener could entirely persuade it otherwise. Clara stopped beside the rosemary bush. "This is still alive. It has always been alive." "You said once it was dying." "I was mistaken." "Did you tell it?" "I thought it would be discouraging." Clara smiled. She touched one of the branches. "It was Aunt Margaret who planted this, wasn't it?" "Yes." "Do you remember?" "Very well." She waited. Elias looked toward the sea. It was spring. That was all he said, but the memory had already opened. He saw Margaret again, as she had been then, younger than Clara was now, kneeling in the earth, with her skirt gathered carefully around her ankles. Her hair had escaped its pins. The wind had blown soil across her gloves, and she had laughed when Elias told her that no respectable plant would agree to live in such a place. She had always laughed at his certainty. Clara watched him. "You miss her?" Elias's eyes remained upon the garden. "Yes." There was no hesitation. The answer surprised Clara because he seldom said it. She moved closer. "I miss her too." Elias looked at her. "You were very young." "I remember enough. I remember enough." He nodded. For a while, they stood together beside the rosemary. The sea moved beyond the wall. Somewhere in the village, a bell rang once. A horse passed along the road. The world continued. Clara picked a small piece of dead leaf from the rosemary. "I remember her hands," she said. Elias smiled. "So do I. They were always busy." "Yes." "She was always mending something." "Yes." "Or planting something, usually against my advice." Clara laughed. She was not very good at following advice. No, she would have been pleased that the rosemary survived. Elias looked down at the plant. "I think she would have said it survived in spite of me." They laughed together. The moment was gentle, but afterward, Elias felt the familiar weight of memory settle inside him. It was not painful in the way it had once been. Time had changed grief. It had not removed it. Instead, it had worn away the sharp edges until the sorrow could be held without cutting the hand. Clara seemed to understand. She did not speak again. They returned to the cottage for lunch. Thomas arrived shortly afterward, carrying a bundle of tools and looking surprised to find Clara there. "Miss Bell." "Thomas." "You did not say you were coming." "I wanted to surprise my uncle." Thomas looked at Elias. "He looks surprised." "I am." Clara smiled. "Then I have succeeded." Thomas put down his tools. "Do you want me to go back later?" "No," Elias said. Clara said at the same time, "Yes." They looked at one another. Elias smiled. "Perhaps you should stay." Thomas sat down. The three of them ate together. It was an ordinary meal. Bread, chicken, potatoes, tea. There was no great conversation, and yet Elias found himself listening to the sounds of the room with unusual attention. Clara's spoon against the cup, Thomas's chair moving slightly upon the floor, the kettle settling after the water had boiled, and the faint movement of the wind outside the window. He thought suddenly that these were the sounds he would miss. Not the great things, not the lighthouse itself. Perhaps these, the ordinary sounds, the ones a man never thinks to remember until they become memories. After lunch, Thomas went upstairs to inspect the lamp. Clara remained in the kitchen. Elias stood beside the window. "You are quiet," she said. "So are you. I am thinking." "That can be dangerous." She smiled. Then her expression became more serious. "Do you want to leave?" Elias watched the sea. "No." "Then what will you do?" He did not answer. The question had no simple answer. For nearly 40 years, his days had been measured by the lighthouse. Morning inspection, maintenance, weather, evening lamp, night watch. Seasons came and went, but the work remained. If the work were taken away, what would remain of the shape of his days? He had not allowed himself to think about that. Not properly. Clara came to stand beside him. "You could stay with me." Elias looked at her. "For how long?" "As long as you like. You have a small house." "I know. And I have habits." "I know. I snore." "I know." He looked almost offended. "How?" "Thomas told me." "Thomas is a traitor." Clara laughed. Then she took his hand. It was a small gesture. She did not hold it tightly. She simply rested her fingers over his for a moment. Elias looked down at their hands. He remembered Margaret doing the same thing once, many years before, when they had been standing in the lantern room during a storm. She had been frightened then. She had not said so. She had only taken his hand. He had understood. Now Clara was doing the same. Perhaps she was frightened too. Elias turned his hand slightly and closed his fingers around hers. "I am not ready to leave," he said. "I know, and I may never be. I know that too." Outside, the clouds began to gather again over the sea. The light upon the water softened. The lighthouse stood above them, silent and steady. Clara looked toward it. "I think you should show me the lamp. You have seen it. Not since I was a child. That was a long time ago." "I know." Elias took his coat. "Then you should see it again." They climbed together. The staircase wound upward through the tower, and as they rose, the sound of the sea became stronger. Clara's hand brushed the stone wall from time to time, feeling the damp coolness beneath her fingertips. When they reached the lantern room, the afternoon light had begun to fade. The sea stretched in every direction. Greyhaven lay below them. The village seemed very small from that height. Clara stood beside the glass. For a while she said nothing. Elias watched her face. He had brought her here because she had asked. But now he understood that he had also wanted her to see what he had seen for most of his life. The world from the lighthouse was different. The houses seemed temporary. The roads seemed like thin threads. Even people appeared small and distant. Only the sea seemed immense enough to remain unchanged. Clara turned toward him. "I understand." Elias smiled faintly. "No, you don't." She smiled back. "Perhaps not yet." The mechanism began to move. The first lamp of evening came alive. Its light passed over the sea. For a moment, Clara's face was illuminated. Then darkness returned. A few seconds later, the light came again. Elias stood beside her. Neither spoke. Below them, Greyhaven was beginning to light its lamps. One window, then another, then another. Soon the village would be full of small golden squares, and the lighthouse would continue to send its stronger light across the water. Elias watched them all. For the first time since opening the district letter, he did not think only about what might be taken away from him. He thought instead about what might remain. The sea, the garden, Margaret's rosemary, Clara's visits, Thomas's footsteps on the stairs, Agnes's tea, the old cottage, the stories he had not yet told, and, perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that even when a man could no longer keep every part of his life, he might still pass something of it into the hands of another. The thought did not make him happy exactly. It made him peaceful, and peace, Elias had discovered, was often the more useful of the two. Outside, evening settled over Greyhaven. The clouds gathered above the western horizon, and the first stars appeared between them. The lighthouse turned. The sea received its light, and beside the great glass lens, Elias stood quietly with Clara, while below them, the old village began its evening, and the house at the foot of the tower waited with its warm fire, its simple supper, and the faint scent of rosemary drifting through the open kitchen window. The following morning came quietly, with a pale mist lying upon the water and a thin line of sunlight appearing beyond the eastern headland, just as Elias Bell finished winding the little clock on the kitchen mantel. Clara had risen earlier than usual, though she had not yet come downstairs, and from above he could hear the faint movement of footsteps across the wooden floorboards, followed by the soft closing of a drawer and the unmistakable sound of someone searching for something which had been placed somewhere else and forgotten. Elias smiled to himself. The cottage had been quiet for many years, and he had grown so accustomed to its silences that the slightest disturbance could seem almost extravagant. Yet he found that he did not dislike it. There was something reassuring in knowing that another person was moving through the rooms, opening curtains, and setting down shoes, making the small noises which belong to ordinary domestic life. He put another piece of coal upon the fire. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift. The lighthouse stood above the cottage like a pale column against the morning sky, and the upper windows caught the first sunlight. For a moment, the glass appeared almost white, then silver, and finally faintly golden as the sun climbed higher. Elias looked at it from the kitchen door. He had always considered the lighthouse most beautiful when nobody was looking at it. There were no visitors then, no children pointing upward, no fishermen telling stories about storms, no officials making notes upon pieces of paper. There was only the tower, the sea, and the quiet work of the day beginning again. Clara came downstairs wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a shawl over one arm. "You are awake early." "I could say the same. I have always been an early riser." "No." She looked at him. "You have always been an early complainer." Elias considered this. That may be true. She laughed softly and took a cup from the shelf. For breakfast, there was bread, eggs, and the last of the apple preserves she had brought from town. Clara insisted upon making the tea herself, though Elias warned her that Agnes Whitcomb had spent half a lifetime telling people that tea was not a beverage, but a responsibility. "I shall tell Agnes that you said so." "She already knows. You have spoken about her." "Everyone has spoken about Agnes." Clara smiled. "Then I shall visit her later. She will give you too much cake." "I know." "She believes thin people are a personal insult." Clara laughed again. The morning passed without hurry. Thomas arrived shortly after 8, carrying a small wooden box of tools, and together, he and Elias went to the lighthouse to inspect the mechanism. Clara remained below for a while, sorting through a basket of laundry, and later went into the garden. The garden had changed little since the previous day, yet there were signs of autumn everywhere. The lavender had faded to a greyish green. The roses were mostly gone, though a few stubborn blooms remained beneath the wall. Fallen leaves lay in the corners where the wind had allowed them to gather, and the earth was dark and damp beneath the plants. Clara, moved slowly between the beds. She had remembered the garden from childhood as being larger. Most things had seemed larger then. The lighthouse had seemed enormous. The staircase had seemed endless. Her uncle had seemed indestructible. She remembered being 6 years old and standing beneath the great tower while Elias disappeared into the doorway above her. She had cried because she believed he had gone into the clouds. Margaret had laughed and explained that the lighthouse was tall, but not quite tall enough to reach the clouds. Clara smiled at the memory. Then she saw something near the old stone wall. A small wooden marker had fallen over. She bent to pick it up. It was weathered and nearly illegible. There was a name upon it. Margaret. Clara stood still. The marker had probably been placed there years ago, perhaps by Elias himself. It marked the small patch where Margaret had once grown herbs. Clara brushed the dirt from the wood. She remembered her aunt's hands. They had always smelled faintly of rosemary and soap. She remembered Margaret's voice telling her that every garden needed one plant which was allowed to grow in its own fashion. Why? Because if everything is controlled, Clara, you will never know what the garden wishes to become. At the time, Clara had thought this was merely one of her aunt's peculiar sayings. Now she wondered whether Margaret had meant more than she appeared to mean. She set the marker upright again. Above her, the lighthouse bell gave a faint metallic sound as the wind moved around the tower. Clara looked upward. Thomas appeared at one of the lower windows. "Miss Bell?" She waved. He disappeared. A few moments later, he came down the steps. "Mr. Bell wants you upstairs." "Why?" "He says he needs your opinion." Clara looked surprised. "My opinion about what?" Thomas hesitated. "The lamp." She smiled. "Does he?" Thomas nodded solemnly. He said it was important. Clara followed him. Elias was waiting in the lantern room. The morning sun had risen higher now, and the sea was a soft blue beneath the clear sky. A few white clouds drifted far out toward the horizon, and the fishing boats had begun to move closer to the harbor. "What is it?" Clara asked. Elias pointed toward the lens. "Thomas says the glass needs cleaning again." "It does," Thomas said. Elias looked at him. "Do not become ambitious." Thomas lowered his eyes. Clara smiled. Elias walked around the mechanism. "There is nothing wrong with the lamp. I simply wanted you to see the view." Clara looked at him. "You called me upstairs to show me the sea. I thought you might like it. You could have said so." "I did." "No, you said you needed my opinion." "I needed your opinion about whether you liked it." Clara laughed. Thomas looked between them, uncertain whether he had been deliberately deceived. Elias patted his shoulder. "You will learn." They stood together for some time. From the lantern room, the village looked peaceful and distant. The churchyard appeared as a patch of green among the roofs. Beyond it, the harbor lay in a narrow curve, with small boats rocking gently upon the tide. Clara saw a carriage moving along the road. "Is that the road to the town?" "Yes." "How far?" "An hour by carriage. 2, if the driver is Thomas." Thomas looked offended. "I drive quite well." "You do not drive at all." "Exactly." Clara laughed. Elias smiled. For a while, they watched the carriage disappear beyond the trees. Then Elias said, "When I first came here, there was no proper road." Clara turned toward him. "What was there?" "Tracks. Through the fields." "Mostly." "And how did you reach the village?" "Walking." "In winter?" "In winter." "That must have been difficult." "It was." He looked toward the sea. But there were fewer things to hurry for. Clara said nothing. The thought remained with her. Fewer things to hurry for. It was such a simple sentence, yet it seemed to describe something about Elias that she had never fully understood. His life was not empty. It was slow. There was a difference. After midday, Clara went into the village. Elias did not accompany her. He had work to do, and besides, he knew Agnes would be pleased to have Clara without him. Clara found the tea shop warm and busy. Agnes greeted her with an embrace. "You are too thin." Clara laughed. "My uncle said you would say that. Your uncle has been coming here too long." Agnes poured tea. "He is worried." Clara looked down at the cup. "Yes. He will not say so. I know. Men of his generation think silence is a form of bravery." Clara smiled. "And women? We merely know that talking is much cheaper." They laughed. Agnes placed a slice of cake beside Clara. "I cannot eat all this." "You need not." "Then why did you give it to me?" "So that you can feel guilty while eating it." Clara smiled. She understood now why Elias liked this place. There was warmth here. Not excitement, not entertainment. Warmth. The kind that came from people who had known one another long enough to understand that affection did not require ceremony. Agnes lowered her voice. "Has he told you what the letter said?" "Yes." "Does he intend to fight it?" "I do not know." Agnes looked toward the window. "Your uncle has never been good at fighting for himself." Clara thought of Elias, standing in the lantern room. He may not know what he would fight for. Agnes nodded. That is sometimes the trouble. Outside, the church bell struck 1. Clara finished her tea. Before she left, Agnes wrapped 2 slices of cake in paper. "For your uncle. He will say he does not want it." "Then leave it there. And if he says he is not hungry, tell him it was sent by me." Clara smiled. "Then he will eat it." Exactly. The walk back to the lighthouse was pleasant. The afternoon sun had warmed the road, and the sea was calm enough that the cliffs no longer seemed severe. Clara stopped several times to look at the water. She had grown up near Greyhaven, but she had never truly learned to see the sea as Elias did. To her, it had always been scenery. To him, it was information. It told him about the weather, the tide, the season, and sometimes, if he watched long enough, something about the mood of the people who lived beside it. When Clara returned, she found Elias sitting on the low wall beside the garden. He had a book in his lap. He was not reading. "You have been waiting for me." "No." She held up the paper parcel. "Agnes sent cake." Elias looked at it. "I am not hungry." Clara sat beside him. "Agnes knew you would say that." Elias sighed. "Of course she did." They ate the cake together. For a little while, neither spoke. The afternoon light moved slowly across the garden. A bee wandered among the last lavender flowers. The sea beyond the wall was almost perfectly calm. Clara looked at her uncle. "Do you remember the first winter with Aunt Margaret?" Elias lowered his eyes. "Yes." "What was she like then?" He smiled. "She was angry with the cold." Clara laughed. She hated cold weather. She disliked being cold. "That is different." "Very." He looked toward the garden. "She made the cottage warmer." "How?" "Curtains. Curtains. And blankets." Clara waited. "And she cooked." "That cannot be all." "No." Elias smiled. "She made the place feel occupied." The words stayed between them. Clara looked toward the cottage. She understood. A house could have furniture and fire and food and still feel empty. Margaret had filled theirs with the small signs of another person. A shawl over a chair. Flowers in a jar. A cup left beside the stove. A book open on a table. The sound of humming while she worked. Elias had not realized how much those things had mattered until they disappeared. Clara reached for his hand. He allowed her to take it. They sat together until the sun began to lower. Then Elias stood. "I should go up. I will come. You need not. I know." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that reminded Clara of the first time she had visited the lighthouse as a child. Not sadness, Not exactly. Something more like gratitude. They climbed the tower together. At the top, the evening sea had become silver beneath the setting sun. The horizon was clear. For once, there were no clouds. Elias opened one of the windows a fraction. Cold air entered. Clara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. "You will catch cold. I have survived worse." "Everyone says that until they have not." Elias smiled. "That sounds like Agnes. It sounds sensible. Then perhaps you have been spending too much time with her." They stood beside the glass. The sun disappeared slowly. First, the water lost its brightness. Then the cliffs became darker. Then the village below began to glow with the first evening lamps. Elias lit the lighthouse. The flame rose gently. The lens began to turn. Clara watched. Once, twice, again. The light passed over the sea. She thought of the letter. She thought of the garden. She thought of Margaret. And she understood something she had not understood when she first arrived. The danger was not that Elias would lose a job. The danger was that he might lose the shape of a life he had spent nearly 40 years building. She looked at him. He was watching the sea. His face was calm, but his hand rested upon the brass railing in the same way it had the previous evening. Clara moved closer. She did not say anything. She simply stood beside him. Below them, Greyhaven settled into evening. The church was dark now. The harbour lights trembled upon the water. The cottage windows shone warmly beneath the tower. And the garden, hidden in the darkness, waited beneath its low stone wall, holding the rosemary and lavender and the old marker bearing Margaret's name. The lighthouse turned. Its beam passed over the village, then over the fields, then across the sea, and back again. Elias watched it. For the first time in many years, he wondered whether the work of keeping the light alive might not belong to one man forever. Perhaps it belonged to whoever was willing to climb the stairs when the weather was bad, whoever was patient enough to clean the glass, whoever understood that a light was useful only because someone far away might need to see it. He looked at Thomas, who was below checking the mechanism. Then he looked at Clara. Neither of them knew what would happen. For the moment, there was no need to know. The night had arrived quietly. The sea was calm. The fire would soon be lit downstairs. And the old lighthouse, which had stood above Greyhaven long before Elias Bell had come to it, continued to turn its patient beam across the darkening water, holding the night at a comfortable distance, while the little village below settled gently into sleep. The next morning began with a wind from the north, not strong enough to trouble the lighthouse, but persistent enough to make the garden gate complain whenever it was opened, and to send the last brown leaves skittering across the path in little hurried groups. The sea had changed color during the night. It was no longer the soft grey-blue of the previous evening, but a deeper green beneath a pale sky, with long lines of white water forming farther out beyond the rocks. Elias noticed these things before he had finished his first cup of tea. He stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting upon the sill, while Clara moved quietly about the room behind him. She had been awake for some time and had already opened the curtains, letting the morning light fall upon the old table where Margaret had once kept a bowl of apples throughout the autumn months. The bowl was still there. It was a little chipped around the rim now, but Elias had never replaced it. Clara had noticed that. She had noticed many things since coming to stay. The cottage, which to Elias had become almost invisible through familiarity, seemed to her full of small histories. Every chair had apparently belonged to someone before it reached its present position. Every cupboard contained some object which had survived because there had never been a sufficient reason to throw it away. Even the brass kettle had a small dent near the handle, which Clara remembered Margaret making when she had dropped it on the hearth. "You have not replaced this," Clara said. Elias turned. "The kettle?" "Yes." It still works. That is not always the point. It is usually a very good point. Clara smiled. She placed the breakfast upon the table. Thomas will be here soon. He will. And you have work. There is always work. She looked at him for a moment. Uncle. Yes. Would you tell me about the house on the headland? Elias frowned slightly. What house? The one beyond the western path. There are several. The old one with the empty windows. Elias understood. Blackthorn House. Yes. He sat down. Blackthorn House stood beyond the western boundary of the Lighthouse grounds, on a rise of land overlooking a quieter stretch of the coast. It had once belonged to the Merryweather family, though by the time Elias had arrived at Greyhaven, the house had already become more shadow than home. Its windows were tall and narrow, its walls grey with weather, and the garden had gradually surrendered to bramble and grass. It has been empty for years, Clara said. Nearly 12. Who lived there? Elias buttered his bread. Mr. Merryweather. Only him. His sister lived there too. What happened to them? Nothing happened. Clara waited. Elias looked at her. Sometimes people simply leave. That sounds rather mysterious. It is not. It sounds mysterious when you say it. That is because you are listening too carefully. She smiled. Elias took a sip of tea. The Merryweathers moved to Bath. The house was closed. They intended to return. And they never did. No. Why? I never asked. Clara looked surprised. You never asked? It was not my business. That has never stopped anyone else in Greyhaven. Agnes is not an example of ordinary behavior. Clara laughed. Outside, a gull cried. The sound drifted away toward the cliffs. After breakfast, Thomas arrived. He brought a message. A man from the district office would be visiting Greyhaven the following week. Elias accepted the information without comment. Thomas seemed relieved that his employer did not ask any further questions. Then Elias said, "We have work to do." They went upstairs. Clara remained in the cottage. She had brought a basket of mending from town, and she spent the morning beside the window with the sea visible beyond the glass. From time to time, she looked up toward the lighthouse and saw the two men moving behind the lantern windows. She thought about what Agnes had said. Your uncle has never been good at fighting for himself. Perhaps that was true, but Clara was beginning to suspect that Elias had never considered his life something that needed to be defended. He had simply lived it. There was a quiet dignity in that, and yet she could not help thinking that a life could be lived faithfully and still be taken away by someone who did not understand its value. Near noon, Thomas came downstairs. Mr. Bell is going to Blackthorn House. Clara looked up. Why? He received a message. From whom? Thomas shrugged. Mrs. Merryweather. Clara put down her sewing. After 12 years. Yes. 12 years. Yes. Is she coming back? I do not know. Did Mr. Bell tell you? No. Clara smiled. That means he does not know either. Thomas nodded. They waited. A little later, Elias came down. He had changed his coat and carried an old leather case. I am going to Blackthorn House. Clara stood. I am coming. No. Yes. He looked at her. You do not know the road. I do. It is wet. I have shoes. There are brambles. I have a coat. There is nothing to see. That is precisely why I want to see it. Elias considered her. Then he sighed. You have become very difficult. I learned from the best. He looked at Thomas. Did you hear that? Thomas was suddenly interested in the floor. I heard nothing. Wise. They left together. The path toward Blackthorn House ran along the western edge of the headland, where the land rose slightly and the sea became visible on both sides. In summer, the path was lined with wildflowers, but now the grasses had turned brown, and the wind had flattened them against the earth. The farther they walked, the quieter Greyhaven became. The sounds of the village faded. The harbour disappeared behind the hill. Even the church bell could no longer be heard. There was only the sea and the wind. Clara walked beside Elias. He carried the leather case in his left hand. What is in there? Tools. Why does Blackthorn House need tools? The clock. Clara stopped. The clock? Elias continued walking. The house has an old clock, and you are going to repair it. If necessary. Did Mrs. Merriweather ask you? Yes. Clara hurried to catch up. Why now? I do not know. You are very calm about this. I have been a lighthouse keeper for 39 years. People are often less complicated than they appear. Clara looked toward him. Our houses? No. That answer pleased her. The house appeared beyond the trees. Blackthorn House was larger than she remembered. Perhaps childhood had made it seem larger, but she thought not. It stood upon a low rise above the sea, its stone walls darkened by rain, and its tall windows reflecting the pale sky. Ivy had climbed one side of the building and spread beneath the eaves, while the garden gates hung slightly crooked between two stone pillars. The house had an air of waiting. Not sadness, not abandonment. Waiting. Elias pushed open the gate. It made a long, protesting sound. Agnes will hear that from the village, Clara said. Agnes hears everything. They walked toward the front door. Before Elias could knock, the door opened. An elderly woman stood within. She was perhaps 70, perhaps a little older, with silver hair gathered neatly beneath a dark cap and a face marked by years, but not hardened by them. Mr. Bell, Mrs. Merriweather. Her eyes moved toward Clara, and this must be Clara. Yes, I remember you. Clara smiled. I was very small. You were. Mrs. Merriweather stepped aside. Come in. The hallway smelled of dust, beeswax, and something faintly floral, as though the house had preserved a memory of summer despite the years of emptiness. Clara looked around. Furniture stood beneath white covers. A long case clock occupied the far wall. Paintings hung crookedly above the staircase. There were flowers in a vase, though they had been dried rather than fresh. Elias looked toward the clock. Mrs. Merriweather noticed. It stopped yesterday. Elias approached it. Yesterday? Yes. And you want it repaired? She nodded. I would like it running before my brother returns. Clara looked at her. Your brother is coming. Mrs. Merriweather smiled. He says he is. There was something in the way she said it that made Clara think he might not have said so for the first time. Elias opened his leather case. He examined the clock. The case was beautiful, made of dark wood with delicate carvings around the face. Its hands had stopped at 17 minutes past 4. He opened the lower panel. The mechanism was dusty, but intact. Thomas would have enjoyed seeing it. Elias touched one of the gears. Has anyone wound it? No. Since when? Since my brother left. Elias looked at her. That was 12 years ago. Yes. Clara glanced toward the clock. It stopped 12 years ago. No. Mrs. Merriweather smiled. It stopped yesterday. Elias understood. He looked at her for a moment. Then he returned his attention to the mechanism. There were some things people said directly. Others were hidden beneath ordinary words. He did not ask which sort this was. He worked. The room was very quiet. Clara moved toward one of the windows. Beyond the glass, the sea was visible between the trees. She could see the lighthouse in the distance. It seemed strangely small from here. Then she noticed something upon the mantel. A framed photograph. Margaret. Clara stopped. She turned. Uncle. Elias looked up. Clara pointed toward the mantel. He came over. The photograph showed Margaret standing beside another woman. She was younger than Clara remembered, and younger than Elias had last seen her. The second woman was Mrs. Merriweather. For a moment, nobody spoke. Mrs. Merriweather came quietly into the room. "Margaret used to visit me." Elias looked at the photograph. "She never mentioned it. She thought you knew." Elias gave a small, almost incredulous smile. "She was wrong. She often was." There was affection in Mrs. Merriweather's voice. Clara looked at the two women in the photograph. "When was this?" "About 30 years ago." Mrs. Merriweather sat down. "Margaret came here one afternoon when your uncle was away at the harbour. She brought me rosemary from the Lighthouse garden." Elias looked toward her. "Why?" "She said the garden had more than enough." He smiled. "That sounds like her." Mrs. Merriweather's eyes rested on the photograph. "She was worried about me." "Why?" "My husband had died." Elias said nothing. He had known Mr. Merriweather had died. He had not known about that visit. Mrs. Merriweather continued quietly. "I was very lonely then." Clara looked at her. "And Aunt Margaret came here." "Yes." "What did she say?" Mrs. Merriweather smiled. "She said that loneliness was worse in a house where nobody expected you at supper." Clara's eyes softened. "That sounds like her." It was. Elias returned to the clock. His hands moved carefully over the mechanism. He found the problem quickly. A small spring had broken. Nothing serious, nothing mysterious, nothing that could not be repaired. He removed the damaged piece and examined it. "I can fix it." Mrs. Merriweather nodded. "Will it run again?" "Yes." She smiled. "That is all I wanted." Elias looked at her. "Are you sure?" She met his eyes. "No." The answer was so quiet that Clara almost missed it. Then Mrs. Merriweather smiled again. "But it will do for today." Elias nodded. He understood. There were days when that was enough. He worked for nearly an hour. The house remained quiet around them. Occasionally, the wind moved against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, a loose shutter tapped softly. Clara wandered through the adjoining room and discovered a small writing desk covered in dust. Upon it lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. She did not touch them. Instead, she looked toward the sea. The lighthouse was still visible. The beam would not begin until evening, yet she knew it would. It always did. When Elias finished, he closed the clock case. He wound it. The hands began to move. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet room. Mrs. Merriweather closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. "Thank you." Elias put away his tools. "You are welcome." She walked with them to the door. Before they left, she said to Clara, "Your aunt was a good woman." Clara smiled. "Yes." She used to say that the sea made people believe they were alone. Clara looked toward the horizon. What did she mean? Mrs. Merriweather smiled. That was the clever part. She never explained. They stepped outside. The afternoon had begun to soften. The wind had fallen. The sea was almost still. As they walked back toward the lighthouse, Clara remained quiet. After some distance, she said, "Did you know she came here?" "No." "Does that trouble you?" Elias thought about it. "No." "Why not?" "Because it means there were parts of her life I did not know." Clara looked at him. "Shouldn't you have known everything?" Elias smiled. "No." He stopped beside the path. The lighthouse stood ahead of them, catching the late afternoon light. A person is larger than the part of their life another person sees. Clara thought about that. The words seemed especially true of Margaret. Perhaps that was why memory remained so full of surprises. You could spend a lifetime beside someone and still discover, years later, a place where they had once stood, a friend you never knew, a plant they had given away, a kindness they had performed without mentioning it. The thought did not make Elias sad. It made him grateful. They continued walking. By the time they reached the cottage, the sun was close to the horizon. Thomas was waiting outside. "The district officer has sent another message." Elias looked at him. "When?" "Tomorrow." Clara's face changed. "Tomorrow?" Thomas nodded. "He is coming in the morning." For a moment, the three of them stood together. The sea was turning gold. The lighthouse tower rose behind them. Elias looked toward the lantern room. Then he looked at Thomas. Very well. He seemed calm. But Clara noticed that his fingers had tightened slightly around the handle of the leather case. She said nothing. There was no need. The evening light continued to fade. Elias went inside to prepare for the night watch. Clara remained outside with Thomas. Neither spoke for some time. Above them, the first star appeared, then another. And as darkness slowly settled over the headland, the lighthouse began its evening work once more, its great beam moving patiently across the water, touching Blackthorn House for one brief instant before passing onward toward the open sea. Inside the old house, the repaired clock continued to tick. At the lighthouse, the lamp continued to turn, and between the two, across the darkening fields and the narrow road, there seemed to run an invisible thread of time, carrying with it the lives of people who had come and gone, the small kindnesses they had forgotten, and the memories which, despite everything, had refused to disappear. The morning on which the district officer was expected arrived with a peculiar stillness, for the wind had fallen almost completely during the night, and the sea, which was rarely without some movement even in calm weather, lay beneath the cliffs, in broad pale stretches of grey, broken only by the slow rising and falling of the tide. A thin mist rested upon the lower fields, and from the lighthouse windows, the village seemed almost unreal, its roofs softened by moisture, and its chimneys sending narrow threads of smoke into the colourless morning. Elias Bell had been awake since before 5. He had not slept badly, though neither had he slept deeply, and he knew the difference. There were nights when a man slept as naturally as a stone beneath the earth, and there were nights when his body rested while some quieter part of his mind remained awake, listening. This had been one of the latter. He had thought about the letter. He had thought about Blackthorn House. He had thought about Margaret, though that was hardly unusual anymore. And, finally, he had thought about the lighthouse itself. At 5:30 he climbed the stairs and inspected the lamp. The mechanism was working perfectly. He cleaned the glass. He checked the oil. He examined the fittings one by one, not because there was anything wrong with them, but because a man's hands sometimes needed work when his thoughts had become troublesome. By 6 o'clock, everything was in order. Elias remained in the lantern room. The sea was beginning to change colour. A narrow strip of gold appeared beneath the clouds. He rested both hands upon the brass railing and looked outward. 39 years. He had never counted them like this before. Usually the years had passed as the seasons did, one following another, without asking permission. A spring became a summer became an autumn, and before a man had properly finished complaining about the cold, another spring had arrived. But now the years seemed to stand behind him in a long procession. The first winter, the broken lamp during the great storm, the morning Margaret planted the rosemary, Clara's childhood visits. The year the harbour wall was repaired. The winter, when Margaret became ill. The last Christmas. The quiet house afterward. Thomas, arriving as a boy and asking whether a lighthouse keeper was allowed to sleep during the day. Everything seemed to belong to one long morning. And now, someone from the district office was coming to decide what should happen next. Elias heard footsteps on the stairs. He turned. Clara appeared, carrying 2 cups of tea. You have been here all night. No. She looked at him. Nearly. I was working. You always say that when you are thinking. Elias accepted the cup. Do I? Yes. She came to stand beside him. The sun was rising. The first light fell upon the water, and the mist over the village began to lift. For a while neither spoke. Then Clara said, "Are you frightened?" Elias considered the question. No. She waited. He looked at the sea. I am reluctant. That is not the same thing. No. What are you reluctant about? He took a slow sip of tea. Being told that something which has been my responsibility for 39 years is no longer my responsibility. Clara looked toward him. I think I understand. I am not sure I do. He smiled faintly. She rested her hand upon the brass railing. You could tell them what this place means to you. Elias gave a small shake of his head. Meaning is difficult to put into official language. Then perhaps official language needs improving. He laughed. It was the first proper laugh he had given that morning. You sound like your aunt. I shall take that as a compliment. You should. They descended together. The kitchen was warm. Clara had laid breakfast upon the table, and Elias noticed that she had put out the good china. He looked at her. What is this? Breakfast. We have breakfast every day. Not when the district office is coming. The eggs will not become more respectable because of the occasion. I know. She sat down. Eat. Elias obeyed. There was something comforting in being instructed to eat by someone who cared whether he did so. At 8 o'clock, Thomas arrived. He had polished his boots. Elias noticed. You have polished your boots. Yes. Why? The officer. He is not inspecting your boots. Thomas looked down at them. I thought it might help. Elias smiled. Perhaps it will. Thomas sat down for breakfast. Clara poured him tea. For a few minutes they ate in silence. Then Thomas said, Do you know what they want? Elias shook his head. No. They might close the station. They might. Thomas looked uneasy. Clara glanced at Elias. He continued eating. What if they do? Elias put down his fork. Then we will know. That is all. For now, Thomas seemed dissatisfied. He had not yet learned that there were moments when certainty was impossible and that worrying did not improve the situation. At 9:30, they heard wheels upon the road. Everyone became quiet. Clara stood by the window. A dark carriage was approaching from the village. It stopped outside the cottage. A gentleman stepped down. He was perhaps 45, neatly dressed, with a dark travelling coat and a narrow leather case beneath one arm. His appearance was not severe, though there was something careful about him, as though he had spent many years learning how to look at a room without immediately becoming part of it. He approached the door. Elias opened it before he could knock. Mr. Bell? Yes. My name is Arthur Pembroke, District Lighthouse Office. I know. Mr. Pembroke smiled. I was told you might. Elias stepped aside. Come in. The officer removed his hat. Thank you. Clara entered the room from the kitchen. Mr. Pembroke looked toward her. And you are? My niece, Clara Bell. He nodded. Miss Bell. Clara smiled. Good morning. Good morning. There was a brief silence. Then Mr. Pembroke looked around the cottage. It was a simple room, but everything had its place. The floor was clean. The fire was laid. The brass fixtures were polished. A vase of late roses stood upon the table. His eyes paused there. Elias noticed. Those are from the garden. They are beautiful. They are stubborn. Mr. Pembroke smiled. I see. The tension in the room eased slightly. Clara poured tea. Mr. Pembroke accepted. He sat at the table. Elias remained standing. You may sit, the officer said. I prefer standing. Mr. Pembroke nodded. Very well. He opened his leather case. There were papers inside. Elias looked at them. He did not like papers. He had spent much of his life dealing with machinery, because machinery usually had the decency to reveal what was wrong with it. Papers were different. They could hide an intention beneath 12 lines of polite language. Mr. Pembroke selected one document. The district authority has received a report concerning Greyhaven Lighthouse. I know. The report concerns the age of the current keeper. I am aware of that too. Mr. Pembroke looked at him. I am not here to suggest that you have failed. Elias's expression remained unchanged. I know. There have been no complaints regarding the operation of the light. Good. The equipment is maintained above the required standard. Good. You have an excellent record. Elias glanced at Clara. She was standing near the stove. She looked relieved. Then Mr. Pembroke continued. The concern is that the station is becoming too demanding for one keeper. Silence. Elias looked toward the window. The sea remained calm. Who says so? The district office. Have they visited? Not recently. Then they do not know. Mr. Pembroke did not seem offended. That is why I am here. Elias looked at him. The officer closed the file. I want to understand the station before making any recommendation. Something changed in Elias's expression. You are not here to remove me. I have not said that. No. Mr. Pembroke smiled slightly. You are very direct. I am old. That can have advantages. It has some. Mr. Pembroke looked toward Clara. May I inspect the lighthouse? Elias nodded. Yes. They went outside. Thomas was waiting near the tower. Mr. Pembroke introduced himself. Thomas immediately stood straighter. Elias noticed. He did not comment. They climbed the stairs. The officer asked questions as they went. How often was the lamp serviced? How was the oil stored? What happened during storms? How did Elias communicate with the harbor? How long would it take another keeper to learn the mechanism? Elias answered every question. He knew the tower as a man knows his own hands. At the lantern room, Mr. Pembroke stood beside the great lens. The sea stretched around them. The morning mist had disappeared completely now, and sunlight rested upon the water. Mr. Pembroke looked through the glass. It is a remarkable view. It is. You must have seen many storms from here. Enough. What was the worst? Elias thought. The night the eastern light failed. Mr. Pembroke turned. What happened? It was February. Elias looked out toward the horizon. The sea was rough enough to cover the lower rocks. The fog came in before midnight. We lost the eastern lamp. Was it repaired? Yes. How? Elias smiled. With difficulty. Mr. Pembroke waited. Elias continued. Margaret held the lantern while I crossed the lower platform. Your wife? Yes. In a storm? Yes. Was she afraid? Elias looked at the sea. Very. Mr. Pembroke seemed surprised. You knew? She told me afterward. What did she say? Elias smiled. She said she had been too frightened to complain properly. Mr. Pembroke laughed. Even Thomas smiled. The memory seemed to warm the room. Elias continued quietly. She held the light while I worked. When it was finished, we sat on the stairs until morning, because neither of us wanted to climb back down in the dark. Mr. Pembroke looked at him. You stayed there all night? Yes. Why? Elias shrugged. We were tired. There was a pause. Then the officer said, That is quite a story. It was an ordinary night. Mr. Pembroke looked toward the sea again. Perhaps he understood then that Elias had not exaggerated his life because, to the man who had lived it, even extraordinary things had become ordinary through repetition. They descended shortly afterward. Outside, Clara was waiting. She could see something had changed. Mr. Pembroke no longer carried the same formal expression. He looked toward the lighthouse, then toward the cottage, then at the garden. "You have kept all this yourself?" Elias nodded. With Thomas's help, Mr. Pembroke turned to Thomas. "How long have you been working here?" 6 years. "And would you continue?" Thomas glanced at Elias. "If I am wanted..." Mr. Pembroke nodded. They walked toward the garden. He noticed the rosemary. "Old plant." "Very. Who planted it?" "My wife." Mr. Pembroke looked at Elias. She must have been a remarkable woman. She was. There was no elaboration. There did not need to be. The officer touched one of the rosemary branches. Then he withdrew his hand. "Do you mind if I walk toward the western path?" Elias looked at him. "Why?" "I saw Blackthorn House from the tower." Clara looked at her uncle. Elias nodded. "Come." They walked west. The afternoon was beginning to warm. The sea was bright beneath the sun, and the cliffs no longer appeared dark or threatening. Blackthorn House stood in the distance, its windows catching the light. Mr. Pembroke stopped. "That house has been empty. For 12 years. Not entirely." Elias looked at him. Mrs. Merriweather returned. Mr. Pembroke nodded. "Yesterday." "You knew?" "I received a notice." Clara looked at Elias. There was something peculiar about the coincidence. Mr. Pembroke opened his leather case. He removed another paper. "This may interest you." Elias took it. He read. Then he read it again. Clara watched his face. "What is it?" Elias folded the paper. "The district owns part of the land surrounding Blackthorn House." "And?" He looked toward the lighthouse. "They are considering a new station." Thomas frowned. "A new lighthouse?" "No." Elias's expression had become thoughtful. "A residence," Mr. Pembroke explained. "The district has been considering a training station for young lighthouse keepers. Greyhaven is isolated enough to be suitable, but the existing cottage is too small." Clara looked toward Blackthorn House. "Then why the review?" Mr. Pembroke answered carefully. "Because the station would require someone to supervise the training." Elias said nothing. Thomas looked at him. The wind moved across the grass. A gull cried overhead. For a moment, the old lighthouse keeper seemed to have forgotten everyone else. He was looking at the lighthouse, at the garden, at the sea, at the cottage where Margaret had lived. At the path leading toward Blackthorn House, Mr. Pembroke spoke quietly. "We are not necessarily asking you to leave." Elias turned. "What are you asking?" "To consider becoming the senior keeper." Elias looked at him. "The younger men would work under you. You would train them. The lighthouse would remain in your care." Thomas's face brightened. Clara said nothing. Mr. Pembroke continued. "If the arrangement is approved, you would no longer be required to climb the tower every night." Elias looked toward the lantern room. "That sounds like retirement." "It is not. It sounds very much like it." Mr. Pembroke smiled. "You would still be responsible." Elias considered this. Responsibility. The word felt familiar, perhaps too familiar. He looked at the sea. For nearly 40 years, he had believed that keeping the light meant standing alone beside it. Now someone was suggesting that keeping the light might mean teaching another man how to stand there. It was not the same thing, but perhaps it was not entirely different either. Clara moved closer. She did not touch him. She simply stood beside him. Elias looked at her. She smiled, very slightly. He understood. The decision did not need to be made that afternoon. Mr. Pembroke returned to the carriage before sunset. Before leaving, he shook Elias's hand. "I will return next week." Elias nodded. "I will be here." The carriage disappeared down the road. Thomas remained by the gate. Mr. Bell. Yes. Would you take the position? Elias looked at the lighthouse. I don't know. Thomas smiled. I hope you do. Then he left. Clara stood beside her uncle. The evening had begun to settle over Greyhaven. She waited. At last Elias said, It is a strange thing. What is? To be offered the chance to stay by being asked to change. Clara looked toward him. Perhaps staying does not always mean remaining exactly as you were. Elias smiled. You have been thinking. I have. Dangerous. She laughed softly. The lighthouse began its evening light. The beam crossed the garden. It touched the rosemary. It moved across the cottage windows. Then it traveled toward Blackthorn House. For a moment, its light entered one of the tall windows there, and in that brief illumination, Elias saw something he had not noticed before. A figure stood inside. Someone was watching from the upper window. He narrowed his eyes. The light passed. The window became dark again. Elias remained still. Did you see that? Clara asked. Yes. Who was it? I don't know. The lighthouse turned. The beam returned. The window was empty. Elias looked toward Blackthorn House. For the first time in many years, the old house did not appear abandoned. It appeared occupied. And whatever had brought someone to its upper window on that quiet evening, Elias had the strange feeling that the story of Greyhaven was not preparing to end. It was only beginning to reveal the parts of itself that had been waiting patiently in the dark. The figure at the upper window of Blackthorn House did not appear again that evening, and by the time the last colour had faded from the western sky, Elias Bell had almost persuaded himself that he had imagined it, for there were many things a man could mistake for a person when seen through rain-darkened glass and the moving beam of a lighthouse. A curtain might stir, a branch might cross the window. Someone carrying a lamp through a distant room might seem, for one brief instant, to be standing perfectly still. Nevertheless, when Elias went downstairs, after finishing his evening inspection, he found that he had left the kitchen door open. Clara was beside the stove. You forgot to shut it. I know. You never forget. I did tonight. She looked at him. Blackthorn House. Elias removed his coat. Perhaps. Clara did not ask anything more. She had learned, during the few days she had been at Greyhaven, that her uncle sometimes needed silence before he was ready to speak, and that questions asked too soon only made him retreat farther into himself. So she placed another piece of coal upon the fire and returned to her sewing. For a while there was nothing in the room except the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock. Then Elias sat down. I saw someone in the upper window. Clara looked up. I thought you might have. You saw them? No. Then how did you know? You came downstairs looking as though you had seen someone. Elias considered this. That is inconveniently perceptive. I was taught by Aunt Margaret. He smiled. The mention of her name softened something in the room. Clara folded her sewing. Do you think someone is staying there? I don't know. Mrs. Merriweather said her brother was returning. Yes. Could it be him? It could. Then why did he not come to the door? Elias looked toward the window. Perhaps he was not ready. Clara watched him. There was something in his voice that suggested he was thinking of more than the house. Are you worried? No. Curious? Yes. That is worse. Sometimes. She smiled. Elias rose. He crossed to the window and looked toward Blackthorn House. The house was completely dark now. Only the sea beyond it held any light, reflecting the stars in broken silver lines. Elias stood there for a long moment. Then he closed the curtain. Go to bed, he said. You sound like Aunt Margaret. I am improving. No, Clara replied gently. You are becoming more like her. He looked at her. For a moment neither spoke. Then Elias smiled. That may be the greater danger. The next morning brought rain. It began before dawn and continued steadily throughout the early hours, falling upon the roof with such persistence that the sound became almost soothing. The sea disappeared behind a curtain of mist, and the lighthouse tower seemed to rise directly from the grey water, its lower half obscured whenever the wind pushed the rain against the glass. Thomas arrived early. He came in wet to the shoulders and carrying a folded newspaper beneath his coat. "Mr. Bell." "What is it?" "There is a notice." Elias took the paper. The district office had placed a small announcement regarding the proposed training station at Greyhaven. It was brief. Official. Without imagination. Elias read it twice. They have already printed it. They must have done it before Mr. Pembroke came. Elias folded the paper. Clara was standing near the stove. Does that mean the decision has been made? No. But they are preparing. Yes. Thomas looked uncertain. Elias placed the newspaper upon the table. That is how offices work. He said it lightly, but Clara could see that the notice had troubled him, not because of the proposal itself, because the words made the future look real. A week ago, the possibility of change had existed only inside a letter. Now, it had been printed. Once words appeared in print, they seemed to possess a peculiar authority, as though paper could decide what a man had spent his life becoming. Clara poured tea. Perhaps this is good. Elias looked at her. You are very optimistic. I am trying. That is admirable. It is also difficult. I know. Thomas sat down. What happens if you take the new position? Elias looked at him. You would remain here. Thomas blinked. Would I? If you wished. I do. Then there is one problem solved. Thomas smiled. Clara looked toward Elias, and the other. He did not answer. The rain continued. Later that morning, Elias went alone to Blackthorn House. He did not tell Clara. He did not tell Thomas. He simply took his coat and walked west along the headland, while the rain softened the fields into shades of green and brown. The house looked different in wet weather. Its stone walls were almost black. The windows reflected nothing. The garden seemed to have closed around it, brambles and wet grass bending beneath the rain. Elias knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He was about to leave when he heard footsteps. The door opened. The man standing there was tall and thin, perhaps 50 years old, with silver beginning at the temples and a face that seemed more tired than old. He wore a dark waistcoat and held a book beneath one arm. He looked at Elias. Then at the lighthouse, visible beyond the rain. You are Mr. Bell. Yes. I know. Elias waited. The man stepped aside. Come in. Inside, the house was warmer than Elias expected. A fire had been lit in the drawing room, and several lamps burned despite the daylight. There were signs of life everywhere now. Books upon tables, a coat upon a chair, a pair of boots beside the hearth. A cup half filled with tea. It no longer seemed abandoned. It seemed inhabited by someone who had not yet decided whether he intended to stay. You are Mr. Merriweather. Yes. Your sister asked me to repair the clock. She told me. It is working. I heard it last night. Elias looked at him. You were here. Yes. In the upper room. Merriweather smiled faintly. You saw me. I did. I was watching the lighthouse. Elias glanced toward the window. Why? Merriweather did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the fireplace. My sister told you about Margaret? She did. Merriweather looked at him. Then you know she was here? Yes. She was the last person to speak to me before I left. Elias remained silent. The rain moved against the windows. What did she say? Merryweather looked into the fire. She told me I was making a mistake. Elias smiled slightly. That sounds like Margaret. She said I had confused leaving with beginning again. The smile disappeared. Elias knew those words. Not because Margaret had said them to him, but because he could almost hear her saying them. Merryweather continued. I left anyway. Why? I thought distance would solve something. Did it? No. There was no bitterness in his voice, only weariness. He looked toward the window. I came back because my sister is old, and because I am tired of pretending that a man can outrun every place where he has been unhappy. Elias considered this. That is probably true. Merryweather smiled. You sound like Margaret. I have been told. They stood quietly, two older men in a house above the sea, each carrying the remains of a life which had not unfolded exactly as expected. At last, Merryweather said, She gave my sister rosemary. Yes. I remember the smell. Elias looked toward him. She planted it outside the kitchen. Merryweather smiled. She said every house needed something living which could survive neglect. Elias laughed softly. That also sounds like her. The rain began to lessen. Merryweather walked toward the window. Do you know why I came back? Elias shook his head. No, because I saw the lighthouse. Elias looked at him. From the train. You could see it from the railway. On clear mornings. Merryweather rested his hand against the glass. It was there when I left. He paused. And it was there when I returned. Elias said nothing. Merryweather turned. I realized that I had spent 12 years changing everything, except the one thing I should have changed. What was that? Myself. The answer was quiet. Elias understood. He had spent much of his own life beside a lighthouse because it never asked him to become someone else. It simply asked him to keep the light burning. Perhaps that was why he had understood the station so well. It gave people something simple to return to. Merryweather poured tea. They sat together for a while. There was no need for conversation. The clock ticked in the hallway. Rainwater moved along the gutters. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked as the old building settled. Eventually, Merryweather said, Your wife was kind. Elias looked at him. Yes. She visited my sister when nobody else did. I did not know. She never told you. No. Merryweather smiled. She probably thought you would make too much of it. Elias laughed quietly. That sounds exactly like her. When he returned to the lighthouse that afternoon, Clara was waiting. She did not ask where he had been. Instead, she said, There is someone downstairs. Elias removed his coat. Who? Mr. Pembroke. Elias looked toward the kitchen. The district officer stood beside the table. He had removed his hat and was holding a document. Mr. Bell, you have come early. I am afraid so. Elias entered. Mr. Pembroke looked at him carefully. I have news. Elias sat down. Clara remained standing. The proposal has been approved in principle. Thomas, who had just entered from outside, stopped in the doorway. Elias nodded slowly. I see. The training station will go ahead, and the lighthouse will remain operational. Under whose supervision? Mr. Pembroke paused. Yours, if you accept. Silence. Elias looked at the document. You said I would not have to climb every night. You would not. Who would? Thomas, initially. Thomas looked startled. Me. Mr. Pembroke smiled. You have been recommended. Thomas looked at Elias. Thomas looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. Mr. Pembroke continued. You would remain senior keeper. Thomas would become assistant keeper and begin formal training. Eventually, others may come. The room seemed very quiet. Elias looked toward the window. Outside, the garden was shining after the rain. The rosemary moved gently in the wind. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the first night she had held the lantern during the storm. He thought about the old clock at Blackthorn House. He thought about the young man standing awkwardly beside the door, Thomas. He had once been a boy who did not know which end of a wrench to hold. Now he was being asked to take responsibility for the light. Perhaps this was what age was. Not being replaced. Making room. Elias looked at Thomas. "Do you want it?" Thomas nodded. "Yes." "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Good." Elias turned to Mr. Pembroke. "I accept." Clara smiled. Mr. Pembroke looked relieved. "There is one more matter." Elias waited. The district would like to use Blackthorn House as accommodation for the trainees. Elias's expression changed. "Blackthorn House?" "Yes." "Mrs. Merriweather?" "She has agreed to remain there." "And her brother?" "He will remain as well." Elias thought about the house, the clock, the rosemary, the empty rooms filling slowly with life. It seemed fitting. A house that had waited 12 years would become a place where young men learned how to keep a light alive. He smiled. "That may work." Mr. Pembroke gathered his papers. "I am glad." When he had gone, Thomas remained in the doorway. "Mr. Bell?" "Yes?" "Thank you." Elias looked at him. "For what?" "For trusting me." Elias shook his head. "I am not trusting you yet." Thomas looked disappointed. Then Elias smiled. "You have 6 months to prove I should." Thomas laughed. Clara began clearing the cups. The room suddenly felt lighter. Not because nothing had changed, because something had. And the change had not taken everything away. That evening, Elias climbed the lighthouse stairs one more time, as he had done thousands of nights before. Thomas followed him. At the top, the sea was dark and calm. The stars had appeared. The village lights glowed below. Elias checked the lamp. Thomas watched carefully. "You will learn every part of it," Elias said. "I will. You will learn the sound it makes when it is working properly." Thomas nodded. "You will learn how the sea looks before a storm." "Yes." "You will learn that the weather is sometimes more honest than people." Thomas smiled. "And you will learn never to argue with Agnes." "I know that already." "Good." They stood together beside the lens. The lamp began to turn. The first beam passed across the water. Then the darkness returned. Thomas looked toward Elias. "Were you afraid the first time?" Elias thought for a moment. "Yes." Thomas seemed surprised. "Really?" "Yes." "What did you do?" Elias smiled. "I learned the work." The beam returned. It touched the sea, the cliffs, the village, the fields, Blackthorn House, then the open water. Again and again. Elias placed his hand upon Thomas's shoulder. "Being afraid is not the important part." "What is?" "Knowing what to do next." Thomas nodded. Below them, Clara opened the cottage door. Warm firelight spilled onto the path. Elias saw it. For a moment, he thought of Margaret. Not as she had been at the end, but as she had been in spring, kneeling in the garden with dirt upon her gloves, arguing that rosemary would grow where no sensible person would have planted it. He smiled. Perhaps she had been right. Perhaps the best things in a life were often the things planted in places where they were not expected to survive. The lighthouse turned. The light crossed the garden. It passed over the old rosemary bush. Then it moved on toward the sea. And somewhere beyond the headland, Blackthorn House had begun to show small signs of life. A lamp in one window, smoke from a chimney, the slow ticking of a repaired clock. Greyhaven was changing. Elias was changing with it. But the light remained. And as he stood beside Thomas, beneath the great glass lantern, listening to the sea, breathing below the cliffs, he understood at last that a keeper was not merely the man who kept the lamp burning through the night. He was also the man who taught another person why the light mattered. The thought settled quietly within him. There was no triumph in it, no grand farewell, only peace. And when the next beam crossed the dark water, Elias did not watch it as a man watching something he was about to lose. He watched it as a man who had finally understood that some things were made to be passed on. Winter came gradually to Greyhaven, not with one great storm, but through a succession of colder mornings, shorter afternoons, and evenings in which the darkness seemed to settle upon the fields before the village had quite finished its supper. The grass silvered with frost, the garden walls held the pale damp of the season, and the sea took on that deep iron color which Elias had always associated with January, when even the gulls appeared reluctant to venture farther than necessary from the harbor. By then, the arrangements for the new training station had begun. Blackthorn House was no longer empty. The old rooms had been opened, the covers removed from the furniture, the windows cleaned, and the fireplaces brought back into use. 2 young men from the northern coast had arrived to begin their training, and a third was expected after Christmas. They were both earnest, somewhat awkward, and possessed of the youthful confidence which persuaded them that they understood things long before they actually did. Thomas was delighted. Elias was not. He considered enthusiasm a useful quality, provided it was kept under supervision. The first young man, William Harper, had been at Greyhaven for only 4 dava. The second, Samuel Price, had a habit of whistling while he worked. Elias disliked whistle. He had disliked it for 39 years. Margaret had once told him that the fault was not with the whistling, but with his ears. He had never forgiven her for being correct. One afternoon, as Samuel whistled his way up the lighthouse stairs, Elias stopped him. "Do you whistle when you are nervous?" "No, sir." "Then why do you whistle?" Samuel thought about it. "I suppose I like it." Elias nodded. "That is worse." Thomas laughed from behind them. Samuel looked confused. Elias continued upward. There was warmth in the teasing now, and Clara noticed it. She had remained at Greyhaven through the beginning of winter, though she had originally intended to stay only a few days. She had written to her employer in town and asked for an extension, explaining that her uncle required some assistance. This was true. It was simply not the whole truth. She had discovered that she liked the lighthouse. She liked the slow mornings. She liked the garden. She liked walking along the cliffs when the weather permitted. She liked Agnes's tea and Mr. Merriweather's stories, though the latter tended to begin with one subject and end several miles away from it. Most of all, she liked seeing Elias change without admitting that he was changing. He no longer spent every evening alone in the lantern room. Sometimes Thomas accompanied him. Sometimes one of the trainees did. And sometimes Elias remained below with Clara, reading beside the fire while the younger men kept watch. The first time this happened, he had looked almost uncomfortable. "What if something goes wrong?" Thomas had said, "Then I shall come down and tell you." Elias had stared at him. That is not how responsibility works. It might be how retirement works. Elias had frowned. Clara had hidden her smile behind her teacup. But gradually, almost without noticing, he had begun to accept the arrangement. One evening, in late December, Clara found him in the garden. There was frost upon the ground. The rosemary was still green. The lavender had become almost grey, and the last rose bushes were bare. Elias stood beside the old stone wall. "You will freeze." "I am not cold." "You are always cold. That is because you are always warm." She carried a small basket. "What are you doing?" "Looking." "At what?" "The garden. It is winter." "I know." Clara came beside him. For a while they stood quietly. The garden seemed asleep. Yet Elias knew better. He had learned that plants did not die simply because they became still. They rested. They waited. He looked at the rosemary. It survived again. Clara smiled. It always does. No. He touched one of the branches. It survived because someone kept coming back to it. Clara looked at him. The words carried more meaning than he intended. Perhaps he realized it. Perhaps he did not. She only said, "Aunt Margaret would have liked that." Yes. The wind moved over the wall. Elias took a small pair of shears from his pocket and cut away a dead branch. Clara watched. "You are pruning it." "Yes." "Why?" "So that it can grow," she smiled. "Perhaps that applies to more than rosemary." Elias looked at her. "You have been spending too much time with Agnes." "I shall deny it." "Wise." They walked back toward the cottage. Behind them, the garden remained quiet beneath the winter sky, and somewhere beneath the frozen earth, the roots waited for spring. The storm came in February. It arrived in the afternoon beneath a sky the color of lead, moving rapidly across the sea until the horizon disappeared entirely. The wind rose first, then the rain, and by dusk the lighthouse windows were trembling beneath the force of it. Elias knew at once that this was not an ordinary winter storm. He climbed the tower. Thomas followed. The trainees remained below. "Keep the lower doors secured," Elias said. "Yes." "Check the oil twice." "Yes." "And if the eastern mechanism stops, I know." Elias looked at him. Thomas smiled. "I know." They reached the lantern room. The sea was almost invisible. Only the white tops of the waves could be seen through the darkness. The lamp turned. Once. Twice. Then there was a sound. A sharp metallic crack. The light flickered. Thomas froze. Elias did not. "Keep the lamp steady." He moved toward the mechanism. Another flicker. The storm pressed against the glass. "Mr. Bell, I see it." The old mechanism had jammed. It was not entirely broken, but one of the moving components had shifted out of place. Elias opened the casing. His hands remained steady. Thomas held the lantern. Rain struck the windows. The tower trembled. For a moment, Elias was 30 years younger. He was back in that February storm with Margaret beside him, holding the lantern while the wind screamed around the tower. He remembered her frightened face. He remembered her hands. He remembered her saying afterward that she had been too frightened to complain properly. The memory gave him courage, but it also gave him something else, a realization. His hands were not as quick as they had once been. He could still repair the mechanism, but he no longer needed to prove that he could do everything alone. "Thomas." "Yes?" "Take the lower panel." Thomas moved immediately. Together they worked. The storm grew worse. The lamp faltered once, then again, but the light remained. At last, Elias felt the mechanism settle beneath his fingers. There. The lens began to turn smoothly. The beam crossed the storm. Thomas let out a breath. "It is working." "Yes." Elias closed the casing. His hands were shaking now, only slightly, but Thomas noticed. "You should sit." "I am fine." "You are tired." Elias looked at him. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "You are becoming intolerable. I learned from you. Apparently, I have taught you too well." They stood together, watching the light. Below them, the trainees had secured the lower doors. The lighthouse remained steady. The storm passed slowly through the night. Near dawn, the wind began to weaken. The sea remained rough, but the horizon appeared again. Elias looked toward it. Thomas stood beside him. "You see?" Elias asked. "What?" "The storm." Thomas nodded. "It always passes." Elias smiled. "Not always." Thomas looked at him. "Some things stay." Elias rested his hand upon the brass rail. "Yes." The first light of morning appeared beyond the clouds. For the first time, Elias felt no shame in admitting that the night had exhausted him. He was tired. His hands ached. His knees hurt. He was no longer the man who had climbed those stairs without thinking, but he was still the man who knew the lamp. And now, another man knew it too. That was enough. Spring returned to Greyhaven with rain. There was no dramatic transformation. The frost disappeared. The fields became greener. The first daffodils appeared beside the road. The sea became lighter. Birds returned to the cliffs. The garden began to wake. Clara planted new lavender along the stone wall. Thomas repaired the garden gate. The trainees learned their work. Samuel stopped whistling, at least while Elias was nearby. William became responsible for the evening inspections, and Elias began to spend more time in the garden. He did not call it retirement. Whenever Clara suggested the word, he corrected her. Adjustment. You are adjusting very slowly. I have had 39 years to become accustomed to the wrong arrangement. She laughed. One afternoon, Mr. Merriweather came from Blackthorn House, carrying a small wooden box. I found this. He handed it to Elias. The box was old, very old. Elias opened it. Inside were several letters tied with faded blue ribbon. He looked at Merriweather. What are these? Letters your wife wrote to my sister. Elias stared at them. You kept them? She did. Why give them to me now? Merriweather looked toward the lighthouse. Because they belong with you. Elias did not touch them immediately. He was afraid, though he would not have used that word. Not afraid of what they said. Afraid of discovering another part of Margaret that belonged to a world he had not shared. At last, he took the letters. That evening, he read them beside the fire. Clara did not sit with him. She understood that some memories were private, even within a family. Elias read slowly. Margaret wrote about the garden, about the sea, about Clara, about Agnes, about small things, the price of flour, a storm, a broken chair, a new rose, a neighbor's child. Nothing extraordinary, and yet Elias found himself smiling. This was Margaret's life, not merely the part he remembered, the whole quiet accumulation of ordinary days. At the bottom of the final letter, she had written, "The lighthouse is doing well. Elias thinks the winter has damaged the rosemary, but I believe he is wrong." Elias stopped. He laughed. Then he wiped his eyes. Clara, hearing the sound from the kitchen, did not come in. She knew. After a while, Elias folded the letter. He placed it carefully back into the box. Then he carried the box upstairs. He did not hide it. He placed it beside the old sewing case. The two remained together, as they should. Summer came softly. The garden was full again. The rosemary had grown taller. The lavender flowered along the wall. Roses climbed the old trellis near the cottage. Greyhaven became busy with fishing boats and visitors, though Elias had little patience for visitors who asked whether the lighthouse had always been there. He once replied, "No, we build it every morning." Clara had to leave for town in July. She stood beside the gate with her traveling bag. Elias looked at it. "You will come back." "Yes." "When?" "Soon." "That is not a date." "No." He frowned. Clara smiled. "You have become dependent upon my company." "Ridiculous. You made tea yesterday." "I can make tea." "You made it badly." "That is because the kettle was difficult." She laughed. Then she embraced him. It was a longer embrace than usual. Elias held her carefully. When she stepped back, he said, "Take care." "I will." "And write." "I will." "And do not let Agnes hear that I miss you." "She already knows." "Of course she does." Clara walked down the road. Elias watched until she disappeared beyond the bend. Then he returned to the lighthouse. That evening, Thomas came upstairs. "The lamp is ready." Elias nodded. "Good." He stood beside the window. The sea was calm. The sunset had turned the water pale gold. Thomas remained beside him. "You know," he said, "you could go to town." "For what?" "To see Clara. She has only been gone 2 days. 3. Elias looked at him. "You are becoming Agnes." Thomas smiled. "I shall take that as a compliment." Elias laughed. Then the lamp began to turn. The first beam crossed the sea. Thomas watched it. Elias watched Thomas. For a long time, he had believed that the most important thing he had done was keep the lighthouse functioning. Now he understood that it was not. The important thing was that, after nearly 40 years, the light no longer depended entirely upon him. That was the real measure of his work, not how long he had remained. But what would remain after him? He placed his hand upon the young man's shoulder. "You know the light." "Yes." "You know the sea." "I am learning." "You know the machinery." "Yes." "You know what to do when something goes wrong." Thomas smiled. "I call you." Elias laughed. "That is acceptable." They stood together. Below them, Greyhaven was settling into evening. Blackthorn House showed 3 warm windows. The cottage garden was full of summer flowers. The harbour lights trembled upon the water. The lighthouse beam moved steadily across it all. Part 12. The Old Lighthouse Keeper. Years later, people in Greyhaven would remember Elias Bell in different ways. Some remembered him as the keeper who had served longer than anyone else. Some remembered the stories of the great storms. Agnes remembered that he had once tried to convince her that cake was not a necessary part of tea. Thomas remembered the first day Elias had trusted him with the lamp. Clara remembered the garden. But the lighthouse remembered him differently. It remembered the quiet footsteps upon the stairs, the hands that cleaned the glass, the mornings when the sea was calm, the nights when the wind shook the tower, the years when Margaret's voice filled the cottage, the long silence afterward, the young men who came to learn, the old man who slowly learned that passing something on was not the same as losing it. Elias did not leave Greyhaven. He remained in the cottage beside the garden. He walked more slowly. He spent less time upon the tower. He sat beneath the rosemary when the weather was fine. And every evening, when the light began to turn, he would look toward the lantern room. Sometimes Thomas came down afterward to have tea. Sometimes Clara returned from town and sat beside him. Sometimes he was alone. But he was never lonely in quite the same way again. One autumn evening, many years after the district officer had first arrived, Elias sat beside the garden wall. The sky was pale. The sea was calm. The rosemary moved gently in the wind. He held Margaret's old sewing box upon his lap. Inside it was the photograph, the letters, a small piece of blue ribbon, and one dried sprig of rosemary. Clara sat beside him. Neither spoke for some time. The lighthouse began its evening light. The beam passed across the garden. Elias watched it. "Do you remember the first time you saw it?" Clara asked. "Yes." "When you were young?" "No." She smiled. "When you first came here?" Elias looked toward the tower. "Yes." "What did you think?" He thought for a moment. "That it was very tall." Clara laughed. "And now?" He looked at the lighthouse again. "Not so tall." They sat quietly. The light passed over the sea, then came back. Elias closed his eyes. He could hear the waves below the cliff. He could smell the rosemary. He could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock through the open window, and for a moment, beneath all those familiar sounds, he thought he heard Margaret laughing. Perhaps it was only the wind. Perhaps it was memory. He did not need to decide. He smiled. The evening grew darker. The village lamps appeared one by one. Blackthorn House shone softly beyond the fields. The sea became almost black. Above it, the lighthouse continued to turn. Clara rested her hand upon his. Elias covered it with his own. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. A life had been lived. A garden had been planted. A house had been opened again. A young man had learned the light. And the old keeper, who had once believed that his purpose depended upon remaining beside the lamp forever, had discovered something gentler at the end of his long service. The light had never belonged to him. He had only been entrusted with it, and perhaps that was true of everything that mattered. A home, a garden, a memory, a kindness, a story. We kept them for a while. Then, if we were fortunate, we passed them quietly into another pair of hands. The lighthouse turned. Its beam crossed the water. It touched the distant harbour. It passed over the roofs of Greyhaven. It moved across the fields and the old garden wall. Then it travelled onward into the darkness, toward the open sea, where no one could see exactly where it ended. Elias watched until the next turn. Then he lowered his eyes. The night was peaceful. The fire was waiting inside. The kettle would soon sing. There would be tea. There would be bread. There would be the familiar ticking of the clock. And tomorrow, when morning came softly over the water, the lighthouse would still be standing above Greyhaven, its white walls touched by the first pale light of dawn. Someone else would climb the stairs. Someone else would tend the lamp. But the old keeper's work would remain. Not in stone, not in brass, not even in the great beam that crossed the sea. It would remain in the people who had learned, because of him, that a small light kept faithfully through the darkness could make the world feel a little less lonely. And so, beneath the quiet turning of the lighthouse and the patient breathing of the sea, Greyhaven settled into sleep. The garden rested. The houses grew dark. The harbour became still. And high above them all, the light continued its gentle journey through the night.